Talking with the parents here tonight, I'm just so touched that so many people are here. These folks, we've become friends and we've worked so closely together, have thanked me, and I look at them all and I thank them. And it's a privilege to do this. And there's nothing else that I would rather be doing. It's what I've been called to do. Someone asked me, where do you find the time to do it? I said, it's like a loaves and fishes thing. There just turns out to be time. I don't know how that is, but there's somehow time. But Tracy referenced Addie and Allie. They lived 11 days, and it was an incredibly special day, special days. It was the time that I really got to know the folks at Be Not Afraid. It was the time that I got to know Jeremy and Risa, unbelievable parents who traveled the country trying to find hope for their conjoined twins and couldn't find it anywhere, but they found it at UNC and they found it in BNA. And the day that they died, the day before they died, Bishop Burbidge came in, was able to get him to come in and spend time with the family and pray with the family over the girls, and that was something that was incredibly special and meaningful for them. And then for them to ask me to be their godfather was just, I don't have words to describe that honor. But Tracy had titled this talk, I didn't title this, she did. My life as a pro-life neonatologist, confronting a culture of death. Not sure I would have titled it that way. But Tracy, if you know her, is kind of in your face a little bit. And it is the world that we live in. She gave you a little bit of a description of what we deal with trying to support and guide families with very challenging and difficult pregnancies. Babies who are diagnosed with what we might call life-limiting diagnoses or just challenging diagnoses. I mean, these days it doesn't take much for someone to offer someone an abortion or a termination is what people would rather say in my world, but it's an abortion. You know, you don't need any medical reason actually to have an abortion. But if something doesn't look quite right, that will be the first words coming out of an obstetrician's mouth fairly frequently in those visits. And there's reasons for that. There's legal reasons and other reasons. But I think there's also at the heart of it a secular reason where there just isn't the value for these lives that everybody shares that some of us might share. So I just, in this talk, I'll give you a little bit about my journey, how I got here and ended up with BNA, but talk about what it has been as someone who I wouldn't have said when I was in medical school as a staunchly pro-life guy, but as someone who realized the world that he was embedded in, tossed into when he decided to go to medical school, and how he got where he got today. And there's a couple of key factors, points, critical junctures in my journey that have really gotten me here. I want to say that you may not know it, but there's been a devolution of medical ethics over the last 40 years. Some may call it an evolution. That's what they call it at UNC. We have this field now called bioethics, and I think it's the tyranny of the ethicists. But what we've done over the last 40, 50 years is really had a war waged that was actually lost back in the 70s. Where we lost the battle to say sanctity of life was at the core of what we did as medical providers. That's gone. It's totally gone, if you didn't know that. That's been replaced with something called, some people call it the Georgetown mantra. It's been replaced with an ethical framework with principles that include things like autonomy, justice, beneficence, and non-malfeasance. And that all sounds very nice, but it only sounds very nice if it's grounded in sanctity of life. If it's not grounded in sanctity of life, if you think about it for a moment, you can use those principles to justify pretty much anything the hell you want to do. And indeed, that is what people are doing, certainly in the field of medical ethics. So where we see these principles coming in, couple of examples, is related to things like folks who want to commit suicide, medically prescribed suicide. This is an autonomy issue. And then in cases where you're talking about euthanizing either babies, whether they're in the womb or outside the womb, or sick, frail, elderly adults, we talk about beneficence, and we talk about justice and the greater good, and what we could use resources for the rest of the world that is still left behind, and how these lives are a little bit different than the lives that we have, and we can support other people. many more people. So these are all the justifications that I hear on a regular basis. So without a foundation in the sanctity of life, we're lost. It occurred to me today when I was driving here, Hitler could have used these principles to justify everything he did in Nazi Germany, truly. When you have no foundational mores in which you're staking these principles. And that's where we're at in the medical world. So that's the world that I found myself launched into when I decided to go to medical school. And I didn't realize that that world existed. That's the world that I dealt with as I started entering into pediatric residency. And I had no idea this world was out there. Like I said, I was not a raging pro-life guy. But things over the next 10, 15, 20 years after I entered medical school in 1982 would definitely change. In 1979, the first bioethics textbook came out and cited those 4 basic principles as the keys to medical bioethics. And those principles have been taught for the last 40 years now, nursing schools, medical schools, you name it. That is the core ethical curriculum that we are taught as physicians. That is who you're talking to when you're sitting in a doctor's office, unless someone has been well catechized or well evangelized and has some other foundation where they can root those principles. So it's pretty important, not just for babies and when you have a challenging prenatal diagnosis, but I think for all of us to really understand that. That is the world that you're dealing with in medicine right now. So things that changed things for me. In 2000, Teresa, my wife, and I, we had our second child, and Shay, and Shay had Down syndrome. And we didn't have a prenatal diagnosis. We had some suspicion that she might have had some unique things going on, but we didn't do any testing, though we were asked about 20 times, do you want to do the tests? And we had to keep repeatedly saying no. And this was in my hospital where people know what I am about, and in the NICU that I'm directing at the Naval Medical Center, San Diego. Still, and these are really, it's not necessarily OBs who are really looking for the opportunity to do abortions, but they're just checking the legal boxes. They have to make sure that you have said clearly with a mom who's advanced maternal age, that they have actually declined testing and you're safe. You've got it listed in the chart and you're good to go. But she was born and she changed our world. Judy talked, Tracy talked about the train wreck, which is an awesome analogy actually, which I will be stealing. But I love that about you though. But what we got, the day Shay was born, we got a call from a friend who is a pediatric surgeon. He had gotten out of the Navy, was up north in California, we're in San Diego at the time. Mike called into the room. Mike and Denise, they have 3 children with Down syndrome. They've adopted 2 of them, and one of them is their own. Special, special family. And Mike got on the phone and told me about something called Welcome to Holland, which has become pretty popular. A lot of people may know what Welcome to Holland is about. But basically, you're planning this incredible journey with your pregnancy and the child that you're anticipating and all the dreams, the goals, the desires that you have for them. It's sort of like you're planning this awesome trip to Italy. And you're going to see all the great cities, you're going to see all the fantastic art, you're going to visit all the great cathedrals, you're going to have great food and wine. You're on the plane, you've taken Italian lessons, and you spend 6 weeks immersed in Italian. And you're on the plane, you're halfway there, you're rolling along very excited, you're getting closer, you're about to land, and the pilot comes on and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly in Holland." You're like, whoa, we are not going to Holland. Is that a joke? No, you're going to Holland. What you realize is that Holland is very different. It's not Italy, but Holland can be a cool place too. So Mike told us about Holland. The other thing, and this is some of the dark humor that I think helps a lot of the families get through the day, but Mike, Down syndrome kids, most of them have mental impairment, and Shay is pretty significantly mentally impaired. But Mike said, what did you name her, Marty? And I said, Shay. He said, that's good, 1 syllable. That better might have been Anna, same forwards and backwards, but But only a dad who had known that and had lived that could have said that to me at that time. And it made us laugh for the first time, over the course of that day. But the tremendous loss we felt in losing the pregnancy, the baby that we thought we were going to have, and now having a very different baby was incredibly traumatic. And that's what Tracy is alluding to when she talked about the train wreck. So Shay and I made a little trip. In September of 2009, we went up to DC for a press conference. We were invited up there to speak on the impact that Affordable Care Act would have on children with special needs. And the impact has been pretty significant, and it's not been good. But we went up there, and I went with Shay, but there were a bunch of other families there. And this was an epiphany day for me, because I looked around at these families. Some were there with their children in wheelchairs. Some were there with pictures of their children, because the children were just too hard to travel with. Some had lost their children, and so they had pictures. But there were numbers of families up there who had had children with trisomy 13 and 18. Now, for those of you who don't know, trisomy 21, Down syndrome, extra 21 chromosome, a lot of people know that. Trisomy 13 and 18, much less common, but significantly more medical complications associated with trisomy 13 and 18. Heart problems, brain problems, kidney problems, bowel problems, but every baby's different. Every baby is different. You cannot lump them in a category of trisomy 13 and 18. You have to look at the baby and understand what's going on. What is universal for all of them is they have severe mental impairments. So they are all pretty much to a T, if they're full trisomy 13 or 18, severely mentally impaired. Maybe wheelchair bound, may have severe motor impairments. So a very different life that you're looking towards with a child like that. And I looked around though at these people and I said, are you serious? You people have trisomy 13 and 18 kids? That's what they've got? Yeah. Like, but it's lethal. No, it's not. I said, well, everything I have ever been taught in medical school, anything you read in any textbook, they are lethal conditions. Lethal, lethal, lethal. So no, they're not. For the kids that we've been able to advocate for, and these moms were talking to me, we've been able to sustain our children, get them the care that they need, and they've been able to survive. And some of the moms said, well, we fought, our babies lived 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 2 weeks. But they all survived. I said, well, even most of them died before they delivered. No, not true. No, they don't. I thought, wow. And I met a woman there that day whose name is Barb Farlow. I'll come back to her in a minute. But Barb, because she has a bigger role for me later in my life, but Barb had a child with trisomy 13, Annie, was born up in Canada, was hospitalized at Toronto Sick Kids at about 3 months of age. She had fought like crazy to get through the pregnancy, get the support she needed, be able to have her baby born. Got through all that. Annie survived all that, was in the NICU for about 6 weeks, ended up going home, was home. Beautiful video, YouTube videos out there with Annie coming home and Barb's 7 other kids welcoming Annie home. Good Catholic family. But at 3 months, Annie went into the hospital, had a respiratory illness. She was on the peds floor. Barb and Tim went down to get some dinner. They were gone for about 45 minutes. They get paged overhead in the hospital at Sick Kids to go up to the PICU, to the intensive care unit, peds intensive care unit. They go up there. They are now at this point have Annie in a bed. They're bagging her. Her heart rate is low. She looks awful. Her oxygen saturations are low. And Barb and Tim are like, what happened? Well, she just stopped breathing. And we think it's her respiratory virus. And what do you want us to do? Do you want us to put a breathing tube in? What should we do for her? And Barb and Tim on the spot have to make a life decision. If we put a tube in her, we might have to think about longer term, a tracheostomy. We may not be able. Do you want to do that? And Barb and Tim, no time to think, but they said, no, we don't want her to suffer, and we want to let her go. And then Annie died that night, 3 months. So a couple months later, Barb was not feeling right about all this, started requesting records. And come to find out that in Annie's records, a do not resuscitate order had been put on her chart without the Farlow's consent, which happens all the time in this, well, not all the time, but it happens not uncommonly in this country. And she also had been administered a dose of fentanyl, which is a respiratory depressant. It's a pain med. and it wasn't clear why she received fentanyl, and probably that was the cause for her to stop breathing. So Barb changed my world, hearing this story and seeing all these kids and these families and kids who had died but who had been born, and my world was totally rocked. So I went home and I started looking at the literature. I'm like, surely people, and I've never looked at this literature. I just accepted what everyone told me, that these kids all die. And so I started looking at the literature, and sure enough, there are studies showing that these kids, year of age, they might be survivors out to 40% of the kids. I'm like, what? I mean, that's not lethal. That's, in nobody's book is that lethal. We don't tell someone who might have a 40% survival for 1 year at cancer that they're lethal. So Barb got back in touch with me at that point, and it launched a host of things that really started to impact my life. We started working on cases that were getting referred to her for support. Now, Barb and I were trying to do this. We didn't have the unbelievable peer support ministry or the case management resources, but we were trying to guide folks medically. We worked with Father Frank Pavone and Priests for Life with a case up in Canada that was the baby Joseph case. That was a little guy, this is about 8 years ago, who the Canadians refused to trach. And the parents were looking for help and had reached out to Father Frank and reached out to Barb. We figured out a way, and Father Frank figured out a way to get that baby out of the hospital in Ontario down to Cardinal Glennon in St. Louis and get the baby trached and get the baby home for 6 months. And the baby ended up dying at home. But it was something that was important to the family, and it was something that the Canadian health system denied. Barb also introduced me to another thing that's out there, which really testifies in his testimony the need for BNA, is Facebook support groups. So the last recourse that you have when you have no medical support and no one who's willing to help you, other than say your child has a lethal disorder, is Facebook. And so there are all these Facebook support groups out there for families with a variety of disorders. And I'll mention trisomy 13 and 18 a fair bit because they're a little bit more common than some of the others, but it applies to a host of these disorders where we've called them lethal in the past, but these babies have capability of surviving. I think perhaps the only disorder that we deal with, the only challenge we deal with that has a very, very, very pretty guaranteed limited life is anencephaly. And that's where there's an enormous absence of the brain. And those babies are often born alive. They have short lives that may be for a couple of days. But the other kids with disorders that we've typically said are lethal are babies that are variable, but some are capable of surviving. But we've been so busy killing them that we don't know how long they could survive. So Barb got me out on Facebook, and I'll talk about one more family that I got involved with, which was not with BNA, they didn't have a BNA in the UK to work with at that time. But it was a family whose daughter had trisomy 18 who desperately needed a tracheostomy. This is a child who was 6 months old, had airway issues, which a lot of the trisomy babies do, where the airways would collapse, and sometimes they would obstruct their breathing. And what will support that, if you're willing to do that, is a tracheostomy, to put a breathing tube in and just get pressure. And it may not be a lot of pressure, it may just be like CPAP at night for someone who might have sleep apnea. But this can be life-saving. And so I got in touch with this family, and the family had just been through hell. Maria, the little girl, had been trying desperately to keep going, but she'd been spending a lot of time in the hospital. So lots of conversations with the family about what to do. The long short is another 6 months before the NHS, the National Health Service, would really come to grips with the fact that this child was not going to die, and the child needed a trach, and it was the right thing to do. I actually ended up talking with the chief pulmonologist in Leeds, who was taking care of Maria, and we had a number of conversations about what to do with her. And he agreed, she probably needs a trach, but you need to understand our system is a little different. We'll talk about that, we'll consider that. Ultimately, she got trached. Maria is now 6 years old with trisomy 18. She's beautiful, beautiful kid. And her mother is amazing. what happens with these families with medically complex kids, the transformation in love, the spiritual transformation in most of them, certainly these kids can be difficult for some families, but for most families, they're a gift. I mean, it's not the gift you would want, it's not the gift you would ever ask for with a pregnancy, but they're gifts. The family asked me to come over and do a conference for them in the Leeds Hospital about 4 years ago, and I went over and did that. And I met this chief pulmonologist, and we were talking about Maria's case. And he said, Marty, thanks for your help. You know, I feel like I know you. We've talked quite a bit. And I said, yeah. I said, but you should have done this trach a long time ago. And he said, yeah, but you know, well, I was just, you were waiting for her to die? Yeah. So I'm going to come back real quickly towards the end, and I know we're on time limits here, but I want to talk about one other area that I think it's important for you to know about. It's important on my journey, is my quest to have people recognize the association of preterm birth with abortion. So you may not know this and maybe never heard it, but the literature is crystal clear that if you've had one prior surgical abortion, you have a 36% chance for a preterm baby with your next baby. Risk goes up. If you have 2 or 3 or 4 abortions, your risk goes up exponentially. So it's dose related. I mean, there's lots of reasons that it's pretty clear that this association is probably more than association, but it's causation. The kids that really are influenced by this are very preterm births. So if you have one surgical abortion, you have a risk of 69% of having a very preterm birth. That's less than 32 weeks. Most women don't know that. That's not word we're allowed to talk about. That's not word we're allowed to get out. The example, and this just goes back to sort of defining the culture for y'all that you're dealing with. I was asked to serve on an expert panel looking at ways we might prevent prematurity. And it was run by the Surgeon General. This was back in 2007, Bush administration, not Obama administration. And we met up in DC. It was sponsored by the March of Dimes. It was the CDC and civilian expert co-chairs that led each group. I was in the epidemiology group. We were talking about what are the factors that may play into preterm birth and how do we address them. And there was a lot of talk around the room. There were 30 of us in the room, and I'm sitting in this room. First of all, I'm wondering, how the hell did I get invited to this? Who put together this list? But because I'm sitting in here with the wizards of neonatology and obstetrics, I'm like, it's kind of cool, but I don't know why I'm here. But I think I do know why I was there. So we're talking about the same things: smoking, infection. Multiple births, in vitro fertilization, and there's nothing earth-shattering going on here. It's like, why are you bringing us together? I said, all right, we've been doing 2 hours of this. Can we talk about this other thing that we haven't talked about yet? And it's the association of abortion with preterm birth. The civilian co-chair, guy from Canada, says, what are you talking about, Marty? I said, well, I mean, come on. We're in the room. The doors are closed. We could talk about there's an association between abortion and preterm birth. No, really there's not. I'm like, no, really there is. And how about this stuff? So I brought with me the 160 articles that showed that there was an association, had them in my bag. And I said, how about that? He goes, well, you may know a lot about these studies, but actually this meeting is based on the Institute of Medicine report on prematurity, and nowhere in there does it mention an association of abortion and preterm birth. So we're not going to talk about it. I said, no, excuse me. First of all, we want to talk about new things, right? Why are we talking about what's already in the book? I mean, obviously the answer isn't in there, right? Secondly, it is in the book. It's on page 627 in Appendix 2A, and it's listed as an immutable risk factor associated with preterm birth. Now, it would be immutable if a mom had an abortion and she then has a preterm birth. She can't change the fact that she had an abortion, but we could tell people that having an abortion puts you at risk for this so they can make an informed decision. Wouldn't informed consent be really valuable to give to women who are considering an abortion? Well, it's so you can imagine the reaction. It was not that. I don't know. We didn't really put it in the body of the book. I'm like, does it say it has to be in the body? And he said, well, we'll do this. We'll take a vote. Who wants to talk about the association between abortion and preterm birth? Nobody. Sorry, Marty, we're not going to talk about that. So that night, I leave, and I'm coming down the elevator to dinner. There's a CDC co-chair in that room. So there's the academic guy from Canada, and then Eve Lackritz, who is the head of the Women's and the Reproductive Division at CDC. In the elevator, she gets in with me. She looks at me, it's just two of us. She said, Marty, I'm really sorry. I'm like, what are you sorry about, Eve? She goes, Marty, listen. She said, we know at the CDC that there's an association between abortion and preterm birth, but we have clear instructions that we will not be talking about sexual activity or sexual habits in relation to preterm birth at this meeting. And that comes from the Surgeon General. I'm like, really? She goes, yeah. I said, well, all right, we're in the epidemiology group. How about that group down the hall that's talking about disparities? Because you know, Eve, blacks have 4 times the abortion rates that whites have. Do you know what else blacks have? They have 4 times the very preterm birth rate that whites have. Now, I'm not saying that's direct causation, but ain't that worth talking about? And she looked at me and laughed. And she said, you want me to put my hands on the abortion and preterm birth and race rail? Not happening. And that is your medical establishment. So that has led me down a journey, tilting at windmills a fair bit, but in North Carolina, working in the legislature and with groups within the state to try and get recognized in women's right to know bills and in sex education policies, the Association of Abortion and Preterm Birth. It's led to being involved with things like the Heartbeat Law in Missouri and writing support for that legislation, which was passed down there and is being challenged by Planned Parenthood. And it led to appearing in a film called Hush. And this is not me promoting myself, but the messages in Hush, has anyone heard about Hush? Check it out. I think it's online. I don't think you even have to pay for it at this point. But it was a independent Canadian film producer who did this about 5-6 years ago. And what he wanted to focus on was the association of abortion with preterm birth, with mental health in women, and breast cancer. And the woman who produced it is an avid pro-choice director, or directed it. Clearly, and she was swayed by everything that she saw and everything she heard. And her voice is the voice that you hear narrating the film. I'm in it talking about abortion and preterm birth. There's other folks testifying to what goes on with mental health issues, which are significant in relation to abortion, as well as the breast cancer risk, which is real. And we're finding that out more and more as we get studies that are coming out of places like China and other places that are better places to actually study this. So that's a talk for another day. So there's the whole abortion thing, which I've gotten involved in. But then just back to meeting the challenges of a prenatal diagnosis and a potentially life-limiting disorder, those things we talked about, the things that we see in B&A that we exist to deal with. The Facebook support groups are filled with people who need help and are getting bad medical advice and are being told to terminate and abort their babies. What is going on now is just a huge amount of prenatal diagnosis. And Tracy alluded to this with Northam talking about what's going on. What we're doing now with prenatal diagnosis is we're actually checking mom's blood for baby's DNA. So that screening is targeting things like trisomy 13, 18, 21, Turner syndrome, and a host of other things right now. Actually, when you consent to that test, you have to opt out of them testing your blood to see if they can figure out what other genetic things might be going on. That's the way this is working. The blood tests for fetal DNA, they're called non-invasive prenatal testing, NIPT. There's about 4 companies that do these. the tests are variable in their effectiveness. They use different techniques, but they're screening tests. The problem is a lot of people get a screening test result and decide that's something they don't want to deal with. And what do? After they've figured out what trisomy 13 or 18 would be, especially if you read the textbooks that are out there now, is you head off to the abortion clinic. So the recommendation from the American Congress College of OBGYN is to go on and have definitive testing, which would be an amnio. The thing about an amnio is there's risk to an amnio as well. So the amnio risk for losing a baby is probably about 1 in 1,000. And we were talking about this earlier, a couple of us. You know, that seems like, 1 in 1,000. And obstetricians routinely play down that risk. But boy, if you're at the amusement park and getting ready to get on the roller coaster and they said, yeah, our risk on here, just to let you know, we lose 1 in 1,000 riders. Are you getting on the roller coaster? I mean, and what is the point of getting the information, right? So this is the problem that we deal with a fair bit in BNA. We get folks who've gone down that road and now have a diagnosis. And I will tell you that the important reason for folks, obstetricians, medical folks, to get that information is because it changes how they will treat you. If they find out you have one of those conditions, which they call lethal, which are not lethal, they're best called potentially life-limiting or life-limiting, they will limit the care that you're going to get. So that is out there, and that increases the demand for what is going on. And let me just give you a couple of quotes. I think you can't really imagine what my friends and colleagues say to people across the world until you hear some of these quotes from families after they've been diagnosed with one of these lethal disorders. I found out my daughter had full trisomy 18 when I was 18 weeks pregnant. OBs asked me 3 times to terminate. Told me none of these babies survived to birth. If they did, it was only for a few hours. I was even asked, why would you want to give birth to a baby that is going to be no use to society? When we got the diagnosis, I was asked if I minded waiting until tomorrow for the abortion. This is common. A mom will get this diagnosis, and the same day, someone will ask, when do you want to schedule your abortion? What Tracy described, this child that you are attached to, that you love, that you have dreams for, the world is shattered, the train is off the rails, and now you're told that that child is no longer worth living. I mean, I can't imagine what that, I've heard it, but I can't imagine personally what it would do to a woman or a dad to hear that. An OB asked me if I wanted to burden my other kids with such a sibling. Another doctor told me these children lacked all will to live. They were without a soul and unable to experience being alive. I don't know how, I was told by a neonatologist no one with trisomy 18 had ever survived. I was told if somehow he did survive, he would ruin my life. And I was told he would have no quality of life. And that is the new mantra, quality of life. That's what those 4 principles go to. It's all about what will the quality of life be? Let's think about the 4 principles of the Georgetown mantra. We found out about trisomy 18 days before we left for a trip to Africa. We were told it doesn't matter where you give birth, the outcome will be the same for the baby, whether an elite hospital or the African bush. A GYN asked me if I had any children. I said I had a daughter, 9 months old. He said, oh, with a sad face. So you're just like counting down the days, huh? There's a dark cloud coming for her. So this is the language that parents and families are hit with, and then they're offered abortion. And where can they go? I mean, where do you go after you've got news like that? For me, even working on Facebook groups, and I was doing this starting back in 2011, 2010, before Addie and Allie, before I really met Tracy, it was really clear that I could give people medical advice, but that just wasn't enough. They needed a best friend. And they needed someone they could trust and talk to. Because these are things that are so hard to talk to family about. Imagine, you guys are hearing right now about things you've probably never heard of, trisomy 13 and 18. Going home and trying to explain that to your family, and then they go out on the internet and see, oh, they all die. Are you crazy? What are you doing trying to keep this baby alive? And you have no support. You are alone. You are in it by yourself because you're freaking nuts thinking that you can have this baby. You just need to accept that this baby's going to die. Where do you go? And there's great literature, even if the baby dies, that it is the best thing for the mom. So not many people have studied this, but Duke University has. And they have looked at moms with anencephaly. So the worst of the worst, the babies with no brains. Their upper brain is gone. All they have is a brainstem. And what happens when those moms continue their pregnancy? What happens to moms who abort? And it's very clear from their data that the moms who abort have much higher rates: despair, grief, mental health issues, depression, and post-traumatic stress. It's not easy carrying that baby to term. But most of those babies actually do make it to term, probably about 70% of them, anencephaly babies. Little different than trisomy 13 and 18 babies. There's a fair bit of loss for those babies along the way. So where did they go? And you know, when I took care of Addie and Allie and I met Tracy, the Holy Spirit punched me in the head. I mean, this is where you need to be. This is the support that people have to have. You can't help all these people with medical knowledge, and you don't have the skills and the tools to be their friend, their support, and to do the things that they're really going to need to do on a daily, weekly basis, and to spend the hours on the phone or texting with them or on email that they really need. So BNA to me was an answer to prayer, and it's been a privilege to work in BNA. Tracy talked a little bit about what we do in BNA. This is experienced, formally trained peer support counselors. The counselors have been through a difficult prenatal diagnosis. There's some families in the room here, hopefully down the road, as they're working through their challenges, will become counselors and peer support folks that really could be a great blessing to lots of families that are out there. The volume is going up. I mean, Tracy described the volume. There's incredible need. What I see on Facebook, I could make a living if I could somehow get paid, somehow. So I could feed my family just trying to work with people on Facebook. It's all day long. People getting bad advice or people who are hopeless, they have no hope. And they have nowhere to go. At any time, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think at any time we're working with at least 5 to 10 families, at least, at any given time. And that's very labor intensive. You know, I think what I do educating families as far as medical possibilities, what to do during the pregnancy, what to do after the pregnancy. We followed kids, we've had kids that we've followed till they're 2 years old. And so I do that, the medical stuff. What these guys do, I can't imagine what this is. My initial intake with a family member or a mom or a dad is going to be an hour or two on the phone. And then it's multiple conversations after that just to make sure they really understand what's going on. And then it's follow-up conversations. And then if we have a baby who's born and we're moving down the road for other interventions and care, it's more conversation. So it's just lots of work, and it needs to be supported in some way, shape, or form. When I talk to families, what I try and do, the first thing I think one of the most important things I do, tell me if I'm wrong, some of the people in the audience, but is to be a physician who says congratulations. Because I am generally the first medical person who has ever told these people congratulations. No one else has known what to say to them. No one else is out there doing this. You said Catholic organizations. I'm sorry, I don't know of any other organization really that does this work to the extent that we do it and that does peer support. There just isn't. There's not. And there needs to be more, because we're never going to be able to handle the load that is out there, but we'll go where we're called, and we have to. And I think this sums up BNA for me, and then I'm going to end. This is from a novel called Clowns of God by a guy named Morris West. In this novel, Christ comes back to earth. It's sort of an apocalyptic novel set in the Cold War. It's a interesting book, and I love this passage. Some people recognize Christ, some don't. Some are doubting, shocking. And at one point, Christ is at a school for children with Down syndrome, and he's holding a little girl. And Christ looks out at the crowd in the room, because some of the people are saying, some people are saying you're the Christ, and you're not Christ. How can you be Christ? Look at these kids here. Look at these defective children. How can you be Christ? He says, I know what you're thinking. You need a sign. What better one could I give you but to make this little one whole and new? I could do it, but I will not. I'm the Lord and not a conjurer. I gave this mite a gift I denied to all of you, eternal innocence. To you she looks imperfect, but to me she is flawless. Like the bud that dies unopened, or the fledgling that falls from the nest to be devoured by ants. She will never offend me, as all of you have done. She will never pervert or destroy the work of my Father's hands. She is necessary to you. She will evoke the kindness that will keep you human. Her infirmity will prompt you to gratitude for your own good fortune. More, she will remind you every day that I am who I am, that my ways are not yours, and that the smallest dust mite whirled in the darkest spaces does not fall out of my hand. I have chosen you. You have not chosen me. This little one is my sign to you. Treasure her. I think that's what we try and do at BNA. We try and make space for these treasures, and we try to open hearts to accept these treasures. And Mark Twain had a great line. He said, the two most important days of your life, the day you're born and the day you find out why. And the children that we deal with, whether they die inside their incredible moms, or they're born, or they die a year later, or they're 6 years old now, never have to worry about that. They know when they're born, and they are sent here for one reason, and that's to teach us how to love. Thanks.